Okay, so it is 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Eastern. Welcome, Florida Drupal Camp. And I wasn't sure if there was a moderator that needed to do the introductions, but if not, I'm happy to go ahead. I see you're on.
Hi, I'm moderating. Hi, this is Salim. I'm moderating, or I'm monitoring 3 rooms, but go ahead. I'm not sure who the official moderator is for this room.
Oh, it's fine. I
Hello,
think I'm.
that's me.
Oh, hi.
Who is
I'm
this?
Sarah. This is Sarah.
Hi, Sarah. Let me make you the host, and then if you can make me the co-host, I'm the dev panel room. So if you can just make me the co-host, and then you can just run the room here.
Okay.
And then
Started
I'm
so
just going to
promptly.
disappear. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Monica.
I don't really have
Great.
much to introduce, so you can just go ahead and start right in.
Right on, right on. Thank you everybody for joining me today. My name is Monica Flores. You can find me on the web as Monica Deer, and I am a technical project manager at Lullabot. For today's talk, we'll be going over lessons learned from an environmental nonprofit, a national nonprofit that converted to Drupal 8, of which I was the director of digital products. We have specifics on the process, including hiring the designer and working with the development team. We have a lot of case studies on content types, user roles, and permissions, and we'll have plenty of Q&A on the different types of things that happen during the process and my best advice. And so just as some housekeeping, the link to the case study slides I'm dropping here into the chat. And I'm also going to share my screen. And of course, this will also be recorded, so you can always get to this. So any questions that you have, feel free to drop into the chat, and I will keep an eye on that. Maybe Sarah, if you're going to be available, we could also help with that, and we will take it away. So to begin with, again, this is Florida Drupal Camp. This is a case study focusing on converting to Drupal 8, and this is just lessons learned from the build process. We were asked to share the code of conduct, which is on the website. I'll also drop it into the chat. And that is just making sure that folks are aware of guidelines and basic general kind of housekeeping. We also have an invitation for you to join the Florida Drupal Slack channel or email at info@fldrupalcamp.org and our organizers, as well as there's a contribution day this Saturday. So again, you've probably heard this around in the different announcements, but we invite you to come and be a contributor. You can get this listed as part of your Drupal.org username, etc. And so the details of that are there's planned workshops as well as planned initiatives, including for the front end devs, the Olivero theme, which is a new theme coming on online. So we're going to get into the bulk of the talk right now. And again, this is case study, Drupal conversion into 8, or moving a national nonprofit into Drupal. So who is this? This is a nonprofit 501c3 membership-based organization based in Washington, D.C. There are about 40 staff, and of the 40, probably 2 to 3 had extensive experience with the web. Most of the staff were folks like editorial, as well as design, as well as authors, as well as administrators. And the overall process was moving from Cold Fusion onto Drupal 8 on Pantheon, which was, of course, the hosting service that we used. As part of the site, we also had a number of sister and sub sites that we called that were sub brands of the overall organization, including a business network with a directory, a think tank, print publications, whole section of print documents, as well as an online store and an ability to manage donations. And I would be remiss, let me back up one bit. I'm again a technical project manager currently at Lullabot on staff. This case study was during my tenure as the director of digital products at this organization. And I am calling in from Manahawk Lands here in Virginia. I am coming from the perspective of a college educated immigrant Asian woman. I'm cisgendered, I'm married, I have 3 children, And today I'm wearing a fuzzy white shirt. I have glasses, black hair, black eyes, and yes, I'm discussing this in the context of my former work as a Drupal developer on this project. Any questions? And feel free to drop into the channel where you're calling in from. A great resource is native-lands.ca. You can figure out where you're calling in from and also what city or what role you currently play. So the overall timeline was a long one. I am going to share with you the actual what we saw over the whole 3-year period. So essentially, we did quite a lot of planning and content evaluation. So the organization spent probably an entire year prior to my hire in order to get the content in order and to get a sense of what type of content was going to be converted. And common issues that folks had expressed were that the existing content was too difficult to manage, was not timely because links would get out of date or headers would get out of date, advertising would be out of date. And also, just in general, there was a need for having more of a sense of modernization to the site. Just having more better information, having more better content, and having more better look and feel. So we did the planning and content evaluation. I was hired a little bit before the RFP process went out. So if you can imagine, they did a year internal, then they put out the call to have a developer come on board. Then under my tenure, we had the RFP process where we handled finding a development and design team. And then we had a fair amount of time on the design, and then finally the build out. And I've dropped into the chat an actual time frame of how long certain things took. For our internal planning, we really needed to keep coordinated. And again, as I mentioned, these were teams that were not necessarily tech savvy. So for example, I think for many of you, you would use something like Slack to keep in touch with teams, but we were still on email. For many of you, you might use shared documents, but we were just in the process of converting to shared documents. So I would say that when you are building your website for your nonprofit, get an initial gauge of the capabilities of folks on the team, how people prefer to work. So for example, our primary stakeholder preferred to have scheduled meetings, a demonstration, and print copies of the presentation. She didn't want to see anything Google Docy. She didn't want to see any kind of presentation. She didn't want to see links. She wanted to be a walkthrough it. We used these tools that you see, Trello for the cards, figuring out the different phases of the project. Of course, we used Google Docs, as well as some SharePoint for internal staff needs. We worked with the designer using Invisio. So I know that folks have moved over to Figma and some other options today, but Invisio was what we were using at the time. Again, this was 2017. We used Balsamic for mocking up kind of wireframey or quick thinking when we were working as a team to identify different folks' needs. So for example, the editorial team wanted to determine the flow of how the magazine would display separate from the general website. So we would provide kind of like a feedback cycle of wireframes for that. Of course, we used Pantheon and the multi-dev environment in order to test this and allow our team to see things as they were coming on board in the development and the test environments. And then finally, we used a combination of Jira and Active Collab for ticketing, and that was in communication with our external providers. And feel free to, again, drop any questions into the chat. So the scope of the RFP that we eventually ended up sending was quite large. We asked for a number of ways to integrate with these third-party tools. So from this organization, and I would say that this is not very different from other similar organizations, maybe 30-year history, maybe $3 to $4 million. They use Salsa. That's for handling emails that go out to the different customers that they have, customers and allies. Razor's Edge is a tool for donor management, and they have records going back as far as 25 years of who donated how much and the different cohorts of donors. They used Charity Engine as a processing tool to accept both one-time and ongoing donations, as well as ACH donations. There is a business directory where they use Acton as a separate mailing system from the Salsa. So Salsa was for the general team, and then Acton was for the business team. At the time of my coming on board, we also were using Timberlake, which is a dues collection software. Finally, they used WordPress 2 instances, both self-hosted and hosted, to handle the blog, as well as a kind of a small microsite on Joomla, and then a variety of social media tools, including Hootsuite or Spark Social Spark to share content out across the different social media platforms. So as you can imagine, knowledge is pretty much squared out across the organization, and different folks have different needs based on the business function that they fulfill. So design, we put out the call for proposals. We asked for local folks in Washington, DC to connect to give us their design proposals. And we sent along the RFP, got back quite a lot of good feedback, and eventually ended up going with the Web Development Group, WDG. They're local to Arlington, Virginia. With them, we worked on developing the content strategy that the group had taken the full year prior to understand and explain, and then worked with the team iteratively to do 3 design comps on the homepage, as well as kind of kitchen sinky inner page components. So all the different pieces of the site that could be used. And working again in terms of our stakeholders and our editorial folks and getting a good sense of who needed what at what time. We got a good sense of where we were going, and with approval, asked folks to sign off. So we had specific sign off parts to kind of like formalize somebody's commitment to the design as it goes forward. In terms of the development, this was happening following on quite shortly afterward. And again, during the design phase, we were able to stub out quite a lot of content and start the process of gathering content. We used the actual tool called Gather Content to allow the teams to put in the content that they wanted to share and bring over, and then have a kind of organized process in order to organize and manage that. So we used Gather Content in terms of the content planning. And then we put in user roles and permissions. We had to go into a fairly long process of understanding what people needed. So as you can imagine, and I'll drop again into the chat, on my user permissions grid, we had a number of different types of visitors to the site, but we primarily focused on anybody who was an editor, because that controlled what they were able to see. So as you can imagine, we had regular staff people. We had people only concerned with the various directories we had. And then we had successively more and more senior positions who had greater responsibility for the different types of content. So as you can see, there's a fairly large grid that I've linked in the chat here about kind of the user roles and permissions. Again, during the data migration period, we worked with the teams to, first of all, understand internally reports. So as a great example, here is a live list that we used for our build, but was actually a list of all the victories. And the victories were then able to be used by the victory team to figure out, yes, we want to elevate this, or no, we don't need to elevate this, or we can move this. So as you can imagine, we were building reports at the same time as we were building the public-facing version of that report. And then in terms of communication with the team, highly important to continue to document your work. We did put a documentation link again in the chat, so you can take a look at what that looks like live. Also for staff training, we tried to not put anything that is credential driven into the staff training, but we did allow folks to use these resources because, for example, if I left, or if the editor left, or if the manager left, people would still have the ability to manage parts of the site. And the biggest lesson I personally learned from this development phase is 2 hours of planning will save you like 5 hours in the build. So for example, if we just know that it's going to take this type of user role and permission around the content types, then we don't have to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Like, oh, what about this manager? They need this. Or what about this editor? They need this. Think about it in advance, build it in your mind, put it onto the documents you're using, in our case, Google Spreadsheets or a variety of documents, and then build it. And then finally, QA. We internally did QA. Each of the different content area managers were responsible for their own content and QA. So I'll take a little break here. I'm about halfway through my slides. Do folks have other questions that they want to drop into the chat real quick? If not, I'll keep on going. Okay. So how much did it cost?
Question.
Oh yeah, certainly.
What kind of pushback did you have from the client, like when you were proposing the move to Drupal?
Oh, interesting. So there was already a strong determination of wanting to move off of the existing content management systems, which, as I mentioned, were Joomla, WordPress, and actually Cold Fusion. Hey, shout out. So I think there wasn't necessarily a blocker against moving to a CMS. However, in the very beginning, I would say they were open to any kind of CMS. And it just so happened that they went with my recommendation. Again, like if you're using a hammer, you always use a hammer. So I'm always a Drupal person. And I would say that for your projects, anything that requires this level of users, the different types of content, right? Like up to a dozen or more types of content and various kinds of relationships between all of the different pieces of content and then various views, I think would be a natural fit for Drupal. If somebody's doing WordPress, then it would be very much about a blog driven or article driven site. So I could have seen instances where somebody might have recommended that for a different type of project, but just because we had things as various as mapping to donations, to items in the store, to articles connected to green living pieces, connected to images, connected to different lenses, it was a pretty sure shot that we were going to go with Drupal. Yeah, so, and again, I was hired on to the team, so I wasn't necessarily working with the organization in a client in consultant relationship. This was more that I was internal to and embedded with the editors, the decision makers, the stakeholders, and articulating what their needs were and converting that into a tool. We did work with, as I mentioned, an external design team and an external developer team. And the budget here is the considerations that we have. So this was actually spurred by a external foundation who shares budget or financing to the organization, and they really wanted a large investment into the website. Feel free to look at the archives, the Internet Archives, to see what the site looked like prior to 2017, but it is what you imagine, like kind of tweaked and very interesting dimensions and content very outdated. So we just moved everybody into the 21st century. We also needed to collapse everybody, all the different logins and the passwords that folks had across all the different platforms, just move it into one platform, like one place to create a blog post, one place to create a press release, right? We also wanted to move all of the content strategy, project management, and build in-house, if at all possible. So what had happened after my tenure, after the site launched, we just still maintain a product manager who's on staff. We did work with external contractors to do just the design in InVisio, delivered as InVisio files. And then we worked with the development team to take those files and convert them into a custom theme. The editors themselves also did QA and product refinements. Probably looking back, I may want to work with an external QA firm. So if you know those firms, feel free to drop into the chat. It's true, the 21st century. And again, just look at the archives. It was definitely project ripe for review and conversion. And now that it's been some time, it actually worked well for them. They've raised more money, they've gotten more tangible results, they have more visitors, right? So there's a lot that they were able to glean from that initial investment. Okay, so again, during the migration process, we used Gather Content. And again, back to the idea of communication and working with the teams, we had ongoing syncs. We had weekly or bi-weekly syncs with each of the different business units in order to keep on track. Because as you know, people working in nonprofit fields or any field really are busy doing their work, their day-to-day work. So it's hard to get folks to kind of claw back the time and make sure that we're asking for here's 100 articles I need you to take from the list of 800, call the ones that have the highest number of Google hits, and then bring those over into gather content. So we used that to finesse the process. And again, we used analytics to identify the topmost projects, topmost pages that people were visiting. And those then helped us determine how to move things over. A lot of spreadsheets, a lot of ongoing planning, a lot of reminders, and a lot of ongoing syncs. So just build that into the process. I know that for folks who are working in the site, it's not so fun to be working on the project, but project planning easily took 30, 35% of my time. Again, I had dropped earlier in the overall permissions grid. This was definitely a bear, and I would again recommend that folks take some time to work with their stakeholders and really get a sense of how comfortable are folks managing, editing, inputting, deleting content. You may want to take away the ability to delete and only allow unpublish, right? You can also continually refine. So for example, we started with a manager, but then realized that an editor role that's slightly less than a manager would suffice for some other folks who just needed access to, for example, magazine articles. They don't need to deal with pages. They don't need to deal with items in the store. They don't need to deal with Green Business Network members. All they need to do is put their content in. So think about that and build in process time to fully understand what types of groups of users you have. This, again, to the earlier question about why or pushback, we had quite a lot of mind mapping, and I'll share with you here again in the chat. This was an older document from 2016 as folks were trying to get a sense. So what this organization does is it takes all of the content and puts it into different types of buckets. So for example, here's the bucket A, and two different content types are in it, Green Living and the blog. But the Green Living and the blog and let's say the success stories can go into bucket B, right? And then as you think about it, something could be handled across different types of buckets that we're calling content types. And then there's also relationships between everybody. So if you see in the bottom right, this little section appears on any of the news pages. It has 3 related news, but then it also has, for example, on the right side, blog posts or success stories or victories also related to that content using taxonomies. So a lot of mind mapping, and again, asking folks who may not be aware of the capabilities of Drupal to build these randomized or chronological lists of content, how to interact between those two. We did have mapping. Mapping was a bit of a struggle, and this was in regards to a business network. So each business member would pay a fee to join the network, and in return would get added access to their business listing. The business listing has, some information such as you see here, the name, choose from probably 5 categories, the contact information, the location if they wanted to share that, and then if they also wanted to add advertising like banners, if they wanted to pay extra for banners, which would then be put into rotation on other parts of the site. So we internally had to learn about Google Maps, the latency, just how much information you want to show, and just in general, how are people interacting with maps. So I dropped a link into there about how we worked with maps. There was even additional sections. So the subset of the business directory is separately branded, but similar to the main. So for example, if I wanted to publish a blog, I could specify that I wanted to publish the blog both to the main as well as to the subset. So what ended up happening was each piece of content was its own piece of content, its own node, but we would specify turn on and off which categorization or which taxonomy subsite it was attached to, so that if it shows on this business site, it shows with the business theming, but if it shows on the live site, it shows with the kind of master theming. So this allowed the organization to push quite a lot of content across different channels and also reserve content to just their own. So for example, if there was just a business related blog, that would only appear in the business listing. Any questions so far? Okay, There was also a component of print publication. So the organization actually mails to members a physical magazine. The magazine is attached to that list I shared with you earlier from Salsa, from Razor's Edge. These are donors, and they're some of our more lengthy donors, their only relationship to the organization is through the magazine. So if you can imagine, they never come to the website, right? Like this is a very print first, print only group. So we took the back issues, which were hosted on Uberflip, and moved them into Drupal, and then made these relationships. So for example, as you see here, there's an overall issue, then there's a cover image, there's an archive, so you can go see all of the magazines, and then articles are associated with the magazine. You can take a look at that here as well. Very fun. I'm trying to understand, trying to upload PDFs, we're rolling back into the archives and finding magazine archives from 10, 15 years hence. Okay, and we would also want to just make special mention, many folks are doing a blog migration from WordPress. So we did use whatever tools we were able to. We did roll in what we called Green America in the News, as well as press releases. So they're basically media mentions, as well as press releases that the organization came up with, and mix them in with the blog posts coming from WordPress. So as you can see, there's in the link, we connected content to one of the categories and then put it in. So the question is, did you use the domain access module to have the functionality to publish content to the main site and subsite? No, you know what, we didn't. And this was because we had asked the organization to what level of integration is it? And the answer was that it isn't necessarily its own, it's more like a baby of, or a incubation of, or a like a daughter. They did call them daughter and or sister sites. And so what they wanted was everybody to be driven to the one main domain name. But we did have back and forth discussions because there was a little bit of stakeholder feedback that maybe they did want to keep everything on greenbusinessnetwork.org with the link. But as time passed, it was agreed that everything is actually part of this overall umbrella. So all the links are going to be under this one umbrella. I hope that answered your question. Okay, so wow, it looks like we're at the end. So I was going to open this up to questions and answers. And if not, people can think about that a little bit and drop them in. And then I was also going to go through this kind of kitchen sink that we had. But any other questions that people want to drop into the chat, feel free. And again, I did drop quite a lot of information into the chat, which I'm happy to start sharing now. Any questions? If not, I can start just like sharing some of the stuff that we learned, and I'll do that for about 10 more minutes, and then we can wrap it. Sure, yeah, there's quite a lot of links. I didn't know if I wanted to kind of overwhelm folks, but I will drop through a couple of the tabs that we use. And the very first one is at an organization, and I would say this is the case across multiple organizations. Everything happens under a bigger, what we call lens. So if you can see this, we had 4 that were identified and an additional one that was added during the thought process around this. But basically any content on the site is part of one of these, what we call lenses: food or finance or climate or labor. We also added social justice. So when somebody's coming into the site, we can organize all the information around the lens, which is now the case if you go to greenamerica.org. However, it's also possible for somebody to come in at any of the lower pieces here. So as an example, a program is part of a lens. So a program might be something like say no to refrigerants. And so the program itself is part of one or more of these lenses, right? So that's the relationship one to many. Similarly, there might be relevant programs or sister programs associated with that. Then inside a program are campaigns, and an action is associated with a campaign. So a campaign might be a 3 to 6 month project, and an action is a specific item: call your representative, fill out this form, March, right? So these are specific actions attached to a campaign. Campaign can be attached to a program, but an action or a campaign could also just be attached directly to its relevant lens. So there was quite a lot of thinking about, do we need to have a lot of entity referencing? If so, that will then help us in the long run. But then that means people need to think about, how does their specific programmatic work fit in with the overall? We also had what we called pieces, which are just generic informational pieces that were sorted by what, again, we called focus areas. And then we had, highlight or promoted pieces. Then finally, we had all these third-party items, such as signing up for the email, donating with a third-party charity engine, or taking action through Salsa. Okay, so there's quite a lot of thinking. And again, as I mentioned, as much as you can do to think about it first, it makes it easier when we come to the build. Here's an example of the business directory. So for example, any one of these businesses can be attached to a variety of different categories. I think we gave them up to 5. And then the categories are searchable by location. And there's also just a generic directory listing search. But then a manager can edit their content based on what level of permission they have. So for example, if I wanted to update this listing, I was the wee moon, I would be logging in with my username and email, or I would be, I'm still logged in, or I would be asked to connect and pay for upgrading my membership. So we use role expiration. So yep, content and allowing folks to connect, and then us having our own administrative review of what this is, because as I mentioned, we had multiple databases that information was connected to. This is the Agreed Business Network. And again, if you see, it's very similar to what we had on the live blog posts, Twitter, its own Twitter stream. So it's kind of like its own thing, but it's still part of the overall. And then these specific information about getting certified and getting added to the certification directory. So yeah, there was this idea of being powered by Green America. And then as mentioned, the magazine was, this is all the list of the past issues. And then we also added these to the store. So if somebody wants to buy a print version of a past issue, they can indeed do that. Articles connected to the magazine as a node. And then inside the node, yep, they could have kind of articles, randomized ad from a sponsor, return to the archive, ad at the bigger size, all manageable from the interface for the type of user logging in. Open social. The site revamp was intentionally bespoke. Yes, so I don't know, let me think about this. When we were doing our initial review, we were thinking about how would all of the content fit in. And we did, in the long run, identify that folks had such niche needs about how they wanted content to connect to each other. So even, for example, on a blog post, they wanted to have the ability to specify a directory listing on a blog post, like from the business directory, right? So here's an example of the post. It has the title, a hero image using image style to create it, the text. This is pulled from, I think it might be just chronological. It may be chronological based on tag or category. There's the sponsor listing. And then again, for each of these, there may or may not be connections for other content. So we'll take a look at the news. This is the blog, but in the news, yeah, here was another option. So we would have all of the sources as their own content type. And so from the editor's perspective, they would just add the news item, submit which was the source, the source mentioning agency, and then put the content. So then we could build a list of all sources. So I guess to answer your question, no, it was intentionally bespoke, but when we were building it, there was a lot of thought placed on what types of users are going to be using this. Some of the folks have been with the organization since the beginning, 35 years ago. So there wasn't a ton of savvy in terms of creating content. So we wanted to make it as straightforward as possible. Just create, add, edit, no delete, and then just very basic, like sort it and store it directly into what you need it to go to. I'll also get you a sample of what a lens looks like. So here is, as we mentioned, a lens. The lens has different, these are programs associated with the lens, right? And then inside each program are, different actions or campaigns or blog articles or whatever it is that's relevant that they wanted to highlight. And these relationships are all connected from the beginning. So this is its own content type. And remember, we had a list of all victories that pulls from there. This is a bespoke type of content connected to this category. And then we had different types of actions that could be taken, different types of news, and different types of additional news that could be added on. And so the idea was for the blog perspective, or from the news perspective, or from the article perspective, all they need to do is create the title, the content, upload the image, maybe do some tags and sort it into the correct category, and everything else would be created for them. So they don't necessarily need to keep that in mind. And yet another, just one more thing to look at. So there's a totally separate section called living. And in the living, these are also connected to the blog as well as connected to the business listings, right? So these are specific evergreen content, and the content in here needed to reference each other as well as businesses. So here's an example content, same thing, like same overall layout. This looks like it's part of the magazine, and then also inside it is, other stuff in that general area. So this is other articles from the magazine, this is related news, this is, the ad. So quite a lot of connections between items that we needed to map through and just get a sense of when is one piece of content connected to another piece of content connected to another piece of content. Let's see. Oh yes, I wanted to share you a sample highlight. So that great decoration from the front page, this was because they wanted to have this hero kind of carousel. I know everybody likes this. I don't know if it's necessarily effective, but we did end up going with, a way for the folks to manage highlights, and the highlights link directly. And they've used this now for about 3 years. Here's the lenses. They have the ability to promote to homepage for each of these, pull from a victory, automatically feed the latest news, etc. See the latest magazine, right? So whenever a new magazine is posted, it gets pushed. And then up here, in terms of the victories, this is a great page that has pretty much everything used on this site. So it'll have the title, the hero, the source, the text, ability to add images. Some of them can be linked. And then, what's connected to that particular article, as well as kind of relevant news. So we did see, in terms of changes, we did see a huge increase in visitors. We reached 1 million visitors, up from 440,000 in a year, probably about 3 months after we made the conversion. And then in terms of results, we did indeed see a $10 million investment in the organization, probably 3 months after this was kind of up and running, directly tied to the idea that as donors feel more comfortable with the organization, they want to invest more in the organization. Similarly, the Charity Navigator we got another star. So now the organization is really tip-top shape and ready to go forward into the 21st century with fundraising and additional world-changing efforts. So we're at time. Do folks have other questions, or you want to turn on your video or share anything? Thanks so much. And again, I would say, just as final thoughts, the communication aspect was so important. I really think that all of us benefit from learning how to communicate and ascertain from various types of stakeholders what we want to turn that into, because the translation aspect, being able to convert somebody's wish list of, can you add the blog post here? Like, what does that actually mean from a data dictionary perspective, or down to the level? And so I think any developer could have built this, but we were going for a high degree of understanding of how the content connected to each other and who was going to be using it. So as I mentioned, after I left, there's no Drupal specialist on board anymore. It's just the editorial team as well as a product manager. And they've been able to maintain for 3 years now. So yeah, definitely, if there's anything I could ask you to take away from this, please work on listening. We have 2 ears, right? And 1 mouth. Just take the time to really listen, and that will help you in your build process. Thanks so much.